So I'm giving a talk on my review of using Elixir in production for 4 years. And I'll give you the summary right now. If you want to leave, feel free. It's frustratingly easy. And that's the easiest way I've ever described it. So to give a little bit of the context of where I came from and how it was important for me to give context into production, I came from a world of C# and Java applications, having to build things on premises, to private clouds, to public clouds. And when Kubernetes came along, I loved it because of readiness checks and health checks and everything that it gave the ability to keep the app alive. And so fast forward to going to a new startup, and they asked me to be the architectural lead for that team, and I just set the guardrails. I said, we have to have Docker and GraphQL, and I'll run it in Kubernetes, and you can write whatever language you want. I don't really care. And they said, all right, well, let's use Elixir. I was like, never heard of it. Sounds great. And my friend Ian Warshak got me into Elixir. He's the one that I worked with Josh as well. We all started going down this path of building out an iOS and Android at-home healthcare. But I had no Elixir experience. But I had all of the architectural experience of deploying into Amazon, running servers, the operational side, and I wanted to be able to at least talk to people about using Elixir. So instead of focusing on that startup, the focus now is my learning journey of transitioning so I could be productive in my day job. And so what I did was I owned a company doing TV apps for churches. And it started with a TV app for Fire TV. I talked to my church and they said, hey, we just paid $20,000 for a Fire TV app. I was like, that is crazy. I said, what if I did it for $2,000? They said, no, it's okay. So I did it anyways. Over the weekend, I wrote it completely in Meteor.js, created a web app, admin interface, and API. And when it came time to learn Elixir, I was like, why don't I just convert my entire thing just to learn it? And so I did basically a 3 microservices app running in Kubernetes that was doing well. If there was crashes, it would automatically restart. Kubernetes kept it alive. To going into Elixir. So it took me about a month to convert it, and it gave me all the technical chops that I needed to learn for my day job. And it was wonderful. So at a high level, these are all the types of devices I had to be able to connect with. And before today's talk of the Live View native, iOS and Android did not exist in Elixir world, nor did tvOS or Roku or some weird TV app type thing. So I had to build out an interface for each one of these things. And since my day job was setting for GraphQL, I made GraphQL the interface for everything. And how it was set up and how it was working is, opinionated. And I'll get to the opinionated side later. But the short answer is I used an umbrella app. And some people will say that's horrible. Some people will say they love it. And I'll give you some examples later of why that actually worked out really nicely. But in the long run, it wasn't necessarily needed to. But it was something I learned. So the technologies I used through all that are up here on the list. But basically, it started out in GCP, then I converted over to Amazon and RDS because of the security side and the risk profile. And so what I have right now is an app running in Elixir that has nothing exposed out on the internet. Everything's behind an ALB. And behind the APIs that Amazon exposes. And you never log into the nodes. And so Deploying Elixir into the space starting 5 years ago, it was with Elixir releases didn't even exist. It was from Distillery. And so I went through all the pains of trying stuff and figuring it out, and over the years, just kind of mutating and revving on things I appreciated. And so, 4 years later, after all this has happened, it was a job that I was doing on my own in my own spare time. And now I do maybe an hour a week, if I want to, on this project. But about 2 years ago, I handed it off to a team. And one of the things that was really helpful in that handoff was the developer happiness. And things like feedback loops are incredibly important. And knowing the technical maturity of the team that you're working with and be able to meet them where they need to be and help them with that. For example, one of the customers I handed it off to and taught them and trained them, they were using WordPress. And they were having vulnerability attacks, having to patch systems, and it was a nightmare for them. And they started using the GraphQL backend that I built as a CMS, and they loved it. They ended up building just static websites. And with those static websites, it meant that they didn't have a server they logged into. They just deployed to Amazon and fronted it by Cloudflare, or CloudFront. So for them, there's no servers, and they didn't have to worry about the actual back-end side. And so they loved it. So I asked one of the guys as well, there's a quote later, but that team, I trained for about 2 weeks, and like in-depth 2 weeks, and then synced up with them once a week, and then once a month, and then now it's whenever they need help. So this is pretty much what the developer onboarding is like when someone wants to join the team. And it's in the README. And because we were opinionated in certain things, the requirements are you had to have ASDF, Docker, and not even Elixir, because the tool version specified per branch. And so tool versions with ASDF is wonderful. If you haven't used it, please look into it. I chose Docker Compose for doing things like Postgres and other ancillary tools that are helpful there. Some people like running Postgres locally. I hate having to worry about that and having developer setups. I went through so many pains of working with developers and juniors of getting their environments set up and like, all right, which version of Postgres are you running? All right, is it open? Is the password set properly? Going through all that, and with Docker Compose, you just blow it away. And it makes it really easy for reseeding environments too, because it gives you the aspect of immutability of an environment to be able to come and do development, because it means that going from environment to environment, you can always start with a clean slate. So, talking about quality of life tools. So these are the tools that, over the 4 years, some of them I thought I was going to use so much, and some of them I didn't use at all. And some of them I was very surprised by. And I'll talk through them in a little bit, but I thought logging was going to be very, very helpful. Having distributed systems, 3 nodes for replication inside Kubernetes, how it's actually going to get deployed, what's going to work. And it was almost never used. And I work for a logging company. I work for Devo. So that's kind of weird for me to say. But the logs would be used for things like security analytics, for making sure intrusion detections. But that's at the firewall level. So how the app is actually operating is a much different perspective that I thought I would need logging and distribute logging much more. I actually didn't need it. So talk about APM. For me, my recommendation would be get it. Make sure you have it. Don't really care what provider. I'm a little partial. This is AppSignal's interface, and I don't know the state of events for APMs now for Datadog or anything else, but they were the ones that could give me a beautiful graph like this, where I can see, hey, someone wrote a query, and this query was really bad for Ecto, or it took really long to respond here. And they go to the exact query so I could see the shape, so I could tell them what they were doing on the client side wasn't necessarily the most important and the most helpful. For example, I got an alarm when I was watching TV with my family. one night at 8 o'clock and started getting 500 errors. I was like, oh, what's going on? Turns out my client hired someone to do a distributed stress test of about 100,000 users. Well, we're only scaling for 10,000, and so things started falling over. And I started showing to them why it started falling over, because their queries weren't properly written, or weren't as nicely written, I could say. They could have used caching, and they decided to go against the database every single time for a very complex n+1 query. I was like, okay. And instead of fixing the problem, they wanted to throw money at the problem. So we scaled up the nodes on Amazon, and $500 later, after the conference, we scaled it back down. That was it. It was nice because Elixir just reacted to it. It allowed for me to grow and scale very easily with an ecosystem. And the developers never had to fix their queries the day of, because they didn't do testing beforehand. So it allowed to kind of code over. So again, APM makes life very nice. And this is an example of where I thought I would use logging, but I don't. So for example, at the bottom of this, you can see a query. And since everything's broken out into GraphQL, I can very clearly say, all right, this exact command caused this output, and because of the way the GraphQL and Absinthe and the way the apps are running, I could just go into the GraphQL interface and run the same command. See what the problem is. I can see it locally. I can attach to the server. I expose this for everyone. And this is one of the things that, if you use GraphQL is very nice. It gives you a really nice interface for documentation. And it allows for people to interact with you in a very clear way. With that being said, the Absinthe implementation with GraphQL just works. It works with WebSockets. It allows you to just really focus and get your feedback loop much slower, or much faster. So what happens is, I saw an error with APM. I can go in. I can reproduce the query if I needed to. I can attach trace logs if I want through IEX, or I can look in directly. And one of the patterns I'll go through later is I was able to do hot code reloading to test it with the client directly to see if it made an impact for what they needed, because in distributed systems with my environment, I was working with Roku devices, Apple TVs. Those aren't things that I had a really good control loop over to go, hey, connect to my dev server. Let me test your stuff. Oh, you're about to have a Sunday service, and you want people to be able to see it? I might need to do this real quick. And so tools that enabled me to do that were very, very welcome. So one of those other tools that I used is Cafe. I think I'm pronouncing it right. And this is just one of this tool gives you a really nice side effect. And the side effect is, since I'm using Ecto, everything works off of it. So it builds your entire UI off of your Ecto models. You can describe how you want things to look as well. But it gives you an admin interface. So if someone types some data in wrong, submitted a form wrong, or put something in wrong, and I needed to go in from an administrative perspective, and I haven't built out those GraphQL calls yet, or UI for that yet, or if I wanted to hide something from those things and have backend objects that I can just control the settings for, Cafe is really nice. And it just works. One of the other things that's really nice is you can do triggered of actions based upon an Ecto model. So let's say you have a user, and the user wants a password reset, or you want to send them an email, or do some other type of action on it. You can click that user and then choose predefined actions that you define in your code or your Ecto model that allow you to have contextual awareness. And these are things that just really get you closer and closer to interacting with your objects and your your data and your customers much more quickly. So if you use Ecto, it's really nice. If you don't, ignore that. Docker Compose, as I was talking earlier. I like Docker Compose for a few different reasons. Here's an example of using it for a developer setup in a closed loop where you can just get going with Ecto. You don't have to worry about your local machine. There are other side effects if you do release within Docker and Kubernetes to where you can actually do Docker Compose, where you can compile it locally. So your CI/CD server can be mimicked locally as well, so you can have a faster feedback loop if the pipeline's failing. There's things you can set up like that, but it's not necessarily Elixir specific, so just it's nice if you like doing those types of things. This other tool is not ngrok, or is ngrok, but it's not Elixir specific, but it's really nice. So if you have an interface, if you're not using LiveView, if you're using GraphQL, if you're using REST, whatever you need, if you're interacting with, I don't know, let's say Amazon Alexa. Well, Amazon Alexa, you have to do an HTTPS endpoint, which means that you have to have a security or a SSL cert that has been signed by a trusted certificate, trusted CA, which Amazon has to be trusting. You don't get to control that list. So you can't use self-sign. Not only that is when you're getting Alexa commands and testing things and doing a quick feedback loop, you don't want to keep saying, hey, Alexa, play the latest sermon, because that takes a while. So you can have it come in one time, get your entire feedback loop, just keep hitting replay. Or if you have to write a verification engine for a header for authorization check for Amazon, which I had to implement as well for that, which is really, really helpful. So, feedback loops. There's been numerous times in previous companies of one time I was working with QA and I built something and I said, hey, when can I get this tested? And I said, in about 3 weeks. I was like, oh, okay, why? I go, because we don't have servers. And so since that day, it was a very, very frustrating day. I ended up helping them close that feedback loop at that company to about 2 hours. And ever since that, being able to interact with people quickly has been very, very, very nice. So for larger groups and teams that are distributed, I recommend having a feedback loop to where you can produce some sort of image or container or test environment that they can go through and see. And if you can do a custom test environment with custom deploy, have the preview environments for PRs or merge requests, that is amazing. But it takes a lot of DevOps knowledge. If you don't have that, start with the Docker. If you don't have that, throw up ngrok. And they can come through. So feedback loops in Elixir are extremely quick if you want them to be. And what I found is companies have policies that will get in the way of those loops, but they don't need to be. So I really recommend finding ways to shorten your feedback loop for anything that you're developing or testing. Again, connecting with the problem. So one of the examples that I had was someone was having a problem with a live service. Their Roku wasn't working. They messed up some data in their CMS that caused the problem with the physical device. So since Roku has to go through a publication and the devices have to update, it was not sensible for me to update all of the Rokus that are trying to connect. It was go into the server. So for me, it was kubectl and exec into each of those pods, bring up IEX, and I have, since we only have 3 pods, I'd open up shells on each of them, and I put some IO output or trace logs. And then I could see the problem. I could see it replaying. I could replicate with the APM if I needed to, and see the exact problem. Did I make it better? Did I make it worse? Okay. And the thing is, because I was using Docker and the images, if I ever just killed the pod and restarted, the old code would be there. So I didn't have to worry about, am I mutating the server in a bad way for a long term? And I don't necessarily recommend this, but because of I didn't have time for the other things, the way Elixir is set up, it allows you to be able to escape hatch into these things. And I really like that, a double-edged sword. Because if you're not going in Docker and you're just doing a server and you do a hot code patch and you update the files on the server or hot code reload, you don't have the change log of those things. So what I would do each time, if I had to do this twice, and it has saved me customer relationships, honestly. Being able to patch it, and then I made the commit, had my coworkers or friends go through and do a merge request review, and put it in. So it was a good feedback loop within the system, and it gives you escape hatches. And so one of the things with Elixir I really like is they give you really good guardrails, or the language or the ecosystem gives you really good guardrails, but gives you escape hatches when you need to get out. And they're not opinionated and keeping you away from that system, just like DSLs, which could be a different talk. So Opinions. What I've found has been a lot of people are very opinionated on how to implement something. In my personal perspective is, I don't care, but be opinionated. Make a decision. If you want to do React. Don't really care. Phoenix can do great with React. LiveView, do it. Phoenix MVC, the old way. Go for it. If you want to do a Poncho, if you don't know what a Poncho app is, not a big deal. Umbrella, single project. How you want to do those things, there are benefits for each of them, but pick one and stick with it. One of the things I've worked with when I was working to hand off the code base was, hey, this is how you build a CRUD operation with React. Here's how you build it in Absinthe, and here's how you expose it to each of the different types of apps, and here's how you update the GraphQL. And giving concrete examples for those that come after you for each of the things that you're scaffolding is really helpful for when people come after you. So don't really care what your opinion is, pick it and hold it loosely. Be okay with being like, hey, I made something wrong, but this is where we're going right now. Maybe the next project or later we'll come back to it. Don't be afraid to take a step is what I'm trying to communicate. So, hanging off the code. The code that I worked a whole bunch on for 6 months, building out new features and stuff. I switched jobs in my day job, and it was at a place of where I couldn't program anything, or they would consider it theirs from a proprietary perspective. So I wasn't allowed to program it. So I had to find someone to hand it off to. And I was a little worried about Elixir and how that handoff would work, and it ended up being wonderful. Amazing. I talked with some of the guys just to get some feedback, and I'll share it in a little bit, but I was expecting to train people that have never touched Elixir before to take 3 or 4 months before they could start committing code, and it was weeks. And now I'm looking at the project. I did some introspection before the talk, and they're committing code, a team of 2 people, because they have to maintain it. They push changes to production at least once a week, if not multiple times. And they break it. And that's okay. Because the way the Elixir is set up is the way they break it is new features. And when they break a new feature with GraphQL, it doesn't break the apps running. All the apps still connect. The 500 errors are coming across. They get pushed to a Slack channel for them, and they address them. Now, if they break something else outside of the scope, they'll roll it back, but it gives them a faster feedback loop to connecting with their customers, which they love. So, we've got about 10 minutes left. We'll see how far we can go. Talking about performance. It's amazing. Short answer. If you look at the spikes here, you'll see some peaks. This is a 4-week view, and you'll see about 4 spikes, and that is Sunday morning, when churches stream their services. So we handle, I think, about something like 12 million requests a month, and I think they're all below 30 milliseconds, usually below 18 milliseconds for response time. And I'm running on T3 larges in Amazon. If you guys know what that means, it means they are burstable and they cost less. So when I saw the graph and I saw that we never go over 30%, one of the reasons we had to choose T3 large was for network performance. So talking about network performance for the database, on Sunday mornings, and people, I know that's frustration when I load some of the big box names on TV apps, and I want to watch a show, and it takes more than a half a second. I get a little like, surely you can do better. And so I want to just give a good experience. So that good experience costs money, though. So here's an example of how much it costs to run under 30 milliseconds for those response times on average, or 18 milliseconds, I think. But we're looking at about $1,000 a month, honestly. And if I wanted to, I could scale it down to 1 node. But then I wouldn't have Kubernetes clustering. I wouldn't have syncing, and I wouldn't have state that would automatically just migrate. And I would have a little bit slower response time. So if I wanted to lower the price by $200 or $300 a month, I could. And if I didn't care about the application load balancer and exposing on the internet, or going to Gig Elixir or something like that, I could. But because I have the background of Kubernetes and implementation, it's just really easy. So just a recap of what I was talking through a little bit earlier. And this is the recap. And so this is from an engineer. I asked him just, hey, how have you liked it the past 4 years of working with me? I'm sorry. And you're welcome at the same time. But he loved it. And this is a person that got into it quickly, and was kind of thrown into it, and now he likes it. So, recommendations, because we got 2 minutes before questions, right? All right. If you're new to Elixir, this is pretty much it. Start. Do something. Build something. Have fun. The code that I built for the TV app stuff, some of the code, I haven't looked through all of it, but it hasn't been touched in 4 years. Because once I've written it, it works. And that's why I say it's frustratingly easy. Because I could write something ineffectively as I'm learning how things, because I didn't learn pattern matching as faster in certain circumstances that I know now. And I look back at my code, I'm like, oh, that's horrible. I'm like, wow, I really sucked. That allowed me to grow in a safe environment, and it encouraged me to be able to allow others to be able to come behind me and say it's okay to not write it perfect. And so just start. Build something. The other thing I was going to say is gen servers. In 4 years, I went to one of the Elixir trainings on gen servers. It was awesome, and I never used it I didn't use it for another 3 years until I went to Nerves. For a lot of web programming, you don't need to worry about gen servers. They're awesome. Don't worry about it. So, if you're more experienced, create a space for those around you. Give them a boilerplate. Give them a place to run. Give them guardrails. Don't tell them how to solve it. Encourage them. Bring them along for the ride. Consider giving a talk. The other one is hold your opinions loosely, because you might be very like, hey, we have to have no umbrella, or we have to have umbrella. And later you might be like, hey, if we did this, we wouldn't have needed this. Or, hey, there's no ecosystem for hex packages for private repositories. It might be good to do an umbrella app. Or, hey, we might want to develop that. Or we want to do Git submodules. Whatever you guys choose, don't be afraid to change, because, for example, live view earlier today with native, had it existed 4 years ago, I would have made TV apps in that instead of React. But it wasn't a big deal. I'm very excited for that, by the way. All right. Questions?